From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. Now, before we get into the subject of the podcast today, I want to let you all know that this is the final episode of the first season of The Sculptor's Funeral, the season finale. Since last October, I've put out 36 episodes over the course of 37 weeks. It's been a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work, and I need a bit of a break to recharge my batteries, read some more books, and get caught up on some sculpture projects that have been on hold. I'll be back with more in early October, after all the schools and ateliers get started with their new academic year. But in the meantime, I've made the entire archive of the podcast available on iTunes. So instead of just the 10 most recent episodes, you can now stream and download all 36 episodes of the first season. I hope that if you are a relative newcomer to the podcast, you'll give a listen to the older episodes over the summer. And now on to the podcast. Today, the subject of the podcast is a sculptor notable in several ways. First, Malvina Hoffman is an American. We haven't had a podcast all about an American sculptor yet. Secondly, she's a woman. After 36 episodes, I'm finally doing a podcast about a female sculptor. It's long overdue. In this first season of podcasts, I've tried to focus on game-changing figures in the history of figurative sculpture. And due to the history of gender politics in Europe over the last several centuries, this has meant podcasts about men. Women have been largely excluded from studying and practicing sculpture, first by the guild and the apprenticeship system, and then by the academic system. Things started to change in the 19th century, and there were several significant female sculptors on the scene in Paris. Everyone always thinks first of Camille Claudel. But before Claudel, there was also Adèle d'Affry, the Duchess of Castiglione and Colonna, who sculpted under the name Marcello. The École des Beaux-Arts started to allow women to study sculpture there only in 1897. But opportunities to work in the ateliers of Paris were there, more or less, depending on the master of the atelier. Some refused to take in women, while others welcomed them. The first art school in Paris with a sculpture curriculum similar to the École that also allowed women was the Colarossi Academy, which opened its doors to men and women in the 1870s. In any event, Malvina Hoffman, though she was far from the first female sculptor, had a life and career we can regard as significant. And it's a significance that historians are only now starting to appreciate. Like the British sculptor Sergeant Jagger, the subject of a previous podcast, Hoffman is what I call a before and after. Right? She trained in the academic idiom of sculpture, but lived and worked during the rise of Modernism. As someone who studied under Gutzon Borglum and Auguste Rodin, but lived and sculpted until the 1960s, she has perhaps a unique perspective on the changes that occurred in sculpture during that time. But even with all this, I probably wouldn't be doing a podcast about Malvina Hoffman were it not for an extraordinary and unique commission she received. The commission to populate an entire wing of a museum with portrait statues of racial types from all over the planet, known as the Hall of the Races of Mankind. We'll talk about this commission in a minute, but first we're going to get through an introduction to Hoffman's life and training, which is interesting and unique in its own way. Now, Malvina Hoffman was born in 1885 in New York to well-off parents with the pedigree of an old New York family, and who were active participants of the cultural milieu of turn-of-the-century New York City. Her father was a concert pianist, and Malvina was exposed to the arts and professionals working in the arts from an early age, as well as patrons of the arts of the highest social standing. By the time she was 14, she was taking classes at the Art Students League. The Art Students League, for those who have heard of it but don't know exactly what sort of institution it is, it's a sort of a cooperative art school founded in New York in the 1870s, whose purpose was, and still is, to bring art instruction to whoever needs it and wants it, pros, amateurs, kids, and etc. A lot of important American artists have studied and taught there throughout the last century and a half. Anyway, after a few years of learning to draw from life and doing a few small clay sketch models, she attempted her first portrait bust in clay, with her father as the model. The armature for the portrait was a bit of a disaster, and the shoulders kept falling off. But fortunately for 16-year-old Malvina Hoffman, one of her parents' friends happened to be a sculptor, who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts and whose name was Gutzon Borglum. Several decades on, Borglum would become world famous as the sculptor of the Mount Rushmore monument, but at the turn of the century he was fairly unknown. Borglum invited Hoffman to his studio to learn the basics of armature building and clay modeling, and would later give her critiques. There's a photograph of Hoffman's second attempt at her father's portrait, and if it is indeed Hoffman's second attempt ever at a portrait in clay, it's fairly impressive. Another sculptor family friend, Phimister Proctor, let Hoffman use his studio for the summer while he was away, and there Malvina Hoffman, at the age of 17, carved her father's portrait into a piece of Italian marble, which came out very well, and from then on, Hoffman knew she was a sculptor. If sculpture was her main impulse as Malvina Hoffman entered into her adulthood, philanthropy and charity work was a close second. On her own initiative, she started up a rainy day fund for down-on-their-luck artists, and after reading in the newspaper about a newsboy who had lost both his legs in a carriage accident, she spent months raising the money needed to have the boy outfitted with artificial legs. Through a combination of her youth and charm, as well as her social connections, she was successful at getting her father's rich friends to sponsor her charity work. Around this time, at the age of 20, Malvina met her future husband, Sam Grimson, an English violinist who played in the New York Philharmonic Society alongside her father. Hoffman divided her time between social events and philanthropy and occasionally sculpting in her early 20s, but when her father took ill and died in 1909, when Hoffman was 24, Malvina and her mother decided to travel to Europe. Their travels were somewhat typical of the grand tour that many people with means conducted at that time. They arrived in Naples, Italy, and worked their way north through Rome, Florence, Paris, London, and then eventually back to Paris, where Malvina came armed with a letter of introduction written by Gutzon Borglum to Auguste Rodin. No matter where Hoffman and her mother traveled, they seemed to have the connections to make the acquaintance of most of the major artists of the day, whether it was John Singer Sargent in London, or Monet, Jean Cocteau, and Gertrude Stein in Paris. Settling in Paris, Hoffman became familiar friends with all the American sculptors working and studying there, and became studio assistant to the sculptress Janet Scudder. Landing commissions to sculpt portraits of a member of the Astor family, as well as to sculpt the portrait of the American ambassador of France, Hoffman gets her own studio and settles into artistic life in Paris. Hoffman wrote 3 books in her life, and in the third one, published a year before her death in 1966, is her memoir, called Yesterday is Tomorrow. In reading it, we find that Malvina Hoffman lived a life of extraordinary advantage compared with many other artists, through her family connections and readily available funds. And it must be said that in this memoir, Hoffman drops the names of great artists and members of high society with almost comical frequency. It's like she knew everybody. And it would be easy, and I admit sometimes tempting for me personally, to sort of discount Malvina Hoffman's early achievements as a sculptor, because frankly she just had it so easy. However, instead of relying on her privilege to carry her through her career, she capitalizes on her privilege by working and studying as hard as she can, and she exploits her advantages intelligently. One example of this is Hoffman's persistence in trying to meet and work with Auguste Rodin. She had visited his studio 5 times before he consented to allow her in. And when she was admitted, it wasn't just the letter of introduction from Gutzon Borglum she had. She also came with photographs of the work that she had done up to that point to show Rodin that she meant business. Piling on a bit of charm, to which Auguste Rodin was not insensible, he agreed to let her come into his studio and draw and sketch his sculpture, and he gave her critiques as well. She seems to have grown on him, and she became a companion to the elderly Rodin, and was sometimes invited to his country home on the weekends or out to the ballet in the evenings. It's a little difficult to know how much of a master Rodin was to Hoffman, as at Rodin's advanced age at this time he wasn't sculpting much at all, nor did he operate a teaching atelier at this time. By Hoffman's account, Rodin was just as much of a kindly and inspirational figure as he was a teacher. In any event, Hoffman remained Janet Scudder's studio assistant during this time, and she took regular classes at the Colarossi Academy as well. The Colarossi Academy, as I mentioned, was a sculpture school, apart from the École des Beaux-Arts, a little bit more progressive than the École, and allowed women to attend regular classes. The next few years saw Hoffman and her mother return to the United States for the winters, and then back to Paris in the springtime, with trips to London thrown in. When World War I broke out, Hoffman returned to New York and opened a studio there, although she and Rodin corresponded until his death in 1917. Now, it's in New York where we finally get a sense of the sculptor Malvina Hoffman was becoming. Back in Paris, she had admired the new modern ballet, and especially the Russian ballet, and particularly the dancer, Anna Pavlova. Back in Paris, Hoffman had modeled a sketch of Pavlova and another Russian dancer, a little work called The Russian Dancers, which she had worked up into bronze eventually. But back in New York, she had the opportunity to finally meet Anna Pavlova, where she was dancing with the Metropolitan Opera House. They became friends, and Pavlova modeled for Hoffman for several sculptures and dozens of small sketches, and Hoffman even produced a series of posters for the Russian ballet featuring Pavlova. Her most ambitious work during this time was a series of relief panels she made on her own initiative, which records Pavlova's famous Bacchanal dance, a home for which Hoffman tried for years to find, but to no avail. Her biggest success with her series of sculptures of dancers came when someone had commissioned one of her small sketches to be enlarged into a life-size garden monument. And then, improbably, a committee of French critics and museum curators ordered a copy of this same work, known as Bacchanal, for the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. It was installed in 1919, but was later destroyed during the Second World War. In 1923, Hoffman got the commission for a sculptural group to be placed over the entrance to a new building going up in London, known as Bush House. The architect was a New York architect, Henry Corbett, who Hoffman knew socially. Corbett wanted his building to stand as a symbol of American and British friendship, and Hoffman's group was of two male allegories, each representing America and England, holding a single torch over some sort of a Celtic altar, which bears the inscription, "Dedicated to the friendship of English-speaking peoples." The two figures are colossal in scale, about 15 feet high. One of the most famous images of Malvina Hoffman shows Hoffman sitting on the shoulder of one of these figures, chiseling out some finishing touches on the statue as it stands in situ 80 feet off the ground. So what was Malvina Hoffman's work like? It must be said that much of her early work, before the outbreak of the First World War, is fairly mediocre. Her relief work is going after that archaic Greek modernist aesthetic popularized by Antoine Bourdelle and many others, but Hoffman's style is distinctly ungainly, as her work struggles to be conventionally graceful, with faces on her figures that are neither naturalistic or classicized. They're just a bit, insipid. Even her best figurative work in this style, which was largely influenced by Art Deco, is pretty derivative. Her best work by far is decidedly her portrait busts, when she drops the pretenses of modernism and sculpts as she was trained to do in Paris. In her portrait bust, we see that Hoffman has a very keen eye and a naturalism in rendering that is top-notch. But in almost all of her other work, there's a sense that she's trying too hard to affect a style not her own, whether it's Art Deco, or the modernist archaic style of Bourdelle or Ivan Mestrovich, or even academic motifs like her Orpheus and Eurydice. In all this, her work feels like she's imitating a style rather than working truly inside of a style. Only her portraiture, either in bust form or full figure, seems to ring true. And so, had Malvina Hoffman's career continued along as it had in her early years, her legacy would be that of a socialite artist whose social connections allowed her to punch a little above her weight in terms of the commissions she was able to secure. But then, in 1929, after mounting her first exhibition of her work, Hoffman sought out and received the commission that would not only show off her gift for portraiture in an outstanding fashion, but would also secure her place in the history of sculpture in America. And we'll hear all about the Hall of the Races of Mankind when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey everyone, just a few more weeks to sign up and join me in a marble carving workshop up in the UK this August. I'll be teaching hand and machine carving techniques, as well as the use of the pointing machine, the centuries-old device that allows a sculptor to copy a plaster cast into marble. That means that over the course of the 2-week workshop, you will copy a plaster cast from one of the old masters of your choice. In 2 weeks, not only will you have the basics of carving down, you will have created your own marble copy of the face of Bernini's Saint Teresa, or Michelangelo's Dying Captive, or a small-scale torso of the Venus de Milo, or another work of your choice. The fee for this workshop covers all the tools and materials, so you don't have to worry about buying a bunch of tools you might not ever need or use again. And I want to stress that this is a course for beginners as well as advanced carvers, and there is no experience necessary. You don't even have to be a sculptor to take the course. This is the perfect course for beginning sculptor students, or even painters, or just lovers of art, really anyone who has always wanted to know how it's done. The course starts on August 10th and runs till the 22nd, and it's all happening outside of Marlborough in Wiltshire, but you have to sign up by July 1st, and that's just in a couple weeks. So if you've been thinking about it, now is the time. So go to www.thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on the Wiltshire Workshop button, and you'll find all the information you need, as well as the simple application form. But if you have further questions, you can always email me directly at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to help you out. So that's the Wiltshire Workshop starting August 10th, and visit thesculptorsfuneral.com and sign up today. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted a World's Fair, officially called the World's Colombian Exposition, timed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the voyages of Christopher Columbus and the supposed discovery of the New World. Many wonders and advancements were born out of this World's Fair, including the Ferris wheel, Quaker oats, and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. Another lasting remnant of the 1893 World's Fair was the institution of the Colombian Museum of Chicago. The museum started out as a temporary museum for the fair, showcasing exhibits of natural history from around the world for the edification of the fairgoers. One of the organizers of the fair convinced the wealthy Chicago entrepreneur Marshall Field to fund the construction of a permanent museum of natural history in Chicago after the fair ended, and the Field Museum of Natural History was born. A natural history museum, of course, houses exhibits and specimens of geology, botany, zoology, and anthropology. It's an easy enough thing to put together a rock collection and a butterfly collection and preserve plant specimens, but when it comes to anthropology, the study of mankind, things get tricky. You've got your Neolithic tools and your pottery shards, a few skeletons of Neanderthals maybe, and that's adequate to speak about the history of humanity. But how does one create an exhibit of the contemporary state of the species of mankind? This was the question put to the curators of the new Field Museum, which from its outset was one of the largest and most important museums on the continent. In her first book, entitled Heads and Tails, Malvina Hoffman speaks to this question and to the question of her involvement with the museum. And she says, quote, "To know the answer, you would have to be interested enough in the subject of man to explore the ethnographic museums and find out how this subject has been studied and exhibited up to the present time. The very name over the entrance to most of the halls, anthropology, evokes in our minds dummies of sawdust or painted plaster with staring glass eyes and dusty false hair, which has become partially unglued because there's never enough money for upkeep. You would also have to understand that the president and the trustees of the Field Museum are a very alert and courageous group of men. To keep abreast of the times, they decided, after investigating the reasons why the anthropology halls in all countries were generally empty, and the snake and monkey houses always crowded, to step out of the tradition and take a long chance. They felt the races of man should look alive and be actual figures and heads that anyone could recognize and feel to be authentic, without being repulsive. So they decided to try sculpture as a means of revealing man to his brother. And so it came to pass in 1929 that the Field Museum hired Malvina Hoffman to recreate in sculpture a complete collection of what they referred to as the races of mankind, a collection of sculptures whose models represent a broad array of ethnographic types from around the world. These would be displayed in a new wing of the museum dedicated to the collection, called the Hall of Man. The Hall of Man and its collection of 105 portrait busts and full-scale figures, an absolutely enormous output for a single sculptor, was unveiled in 1933, coinciding with another World's Fair happening in Chicago, celebrating Chicago's centennial and called the Century of Progress. Originally, the idea was to commission several sculptors, but Hoffman convinced the museum that she alone should do it, and they agreed. The choice of Malvina Hoffman for this work was not random. Hoffman had already proven that she was capable of the task at hand, as a few years previously to getting the commission, she and her husband Sam had traveled through much of North Africa, where, out of personal interest, Hoffman had produced lots of studies, sketches, and portraits of the racial types she found there. So she had the skills, the natural interest, and with the work that she had already done in Africa, she also had a head start on the project, as her African work could be incorporated into the collection. The Field Museum coordinated a global tour for Hoffman, making arrangements with governments and museums around the world to facilitate her travel and her work. Her first trip was to Europe, where she arranged for her future work to be cast in bronze in Paris and then shipped to Chicago. And while in Paris, she modeled the two European races, the Nordic race and the Mediterranean race. In a stroke of good timing, Paris at that time was hosting a fair of its own, called the Colonial Exposition, which displayed exhibits from the French colonies, including exhibits of native peoples from those colonies. So Hoffman had the opportunity in Paris to make studies for her eventual statues of people from Cambodia, Bali, Somalia, and elsewhere. Paris being the cosmopolitan city it is, Hoffman, while there, found other people from around the world to pose for her as well. After returning from Paris, and after a lot of preparation, Malvina Hoffman and a small entourage left New York for San Francisco, and then on to Hawaii and the Pacific Isles. She was accompanied by her husband Sam, who, due to wounds he received while serving in the First World War, could no longer play the violin, and he worked as Hoffman's assistant. She also brought her secretary, Gretchen, and an assistant named Jean DeMarco, who cast her work into plaster and shipped them back to Paris as the work was produced. Briefly, their travels took them from Hawaii to Japan, then China, Mongolia, all over Southeast Asia and Indonesia, on to India, and then finally Ceylon, before returning to Paris via the Suez Canal. After returning to the United States, Hoffman added the races of Aboriginal Americans, as she calls them, during a trip to the American Southwest, and this included types from Central and South America, as well as Native American Indian tribes. Hoffman wrote a book about this period of her life, I mentioned already. It's called Heads and Tails, and it's a pretty good read. She records many anecdotes and details about her journey, as well as provides a lot of photographs of her sculpture and her models. But before talking about some of the more notable works that she produced for the collection of the races of mankind, I think we should address the elephant in the room for just a minute. We need to discuss just how racist this whole idea is. I mean, the Hall of the Races of Mankind, by definition, it's a totally racist project. But it doesn't mean that Malvina Hoffman and the curators of the museum and the entire field of anthropology in the 1930s were all members of the Ku Klux Klan. To put this issue in context, we need to remember that in the 1930s, globalism as we know it was still in its infancy. Western culture and society had reached the point where, while we knew there were enormous numbers of people all over the world who looked very different from Westerners, and while we were starting to learn about their cultures, no one really knew how different or how similar people in general really were. I mean, in a scientific way, at the sort of genetic level. It really was, at that time, an open question as to whether one physiological type of human had natural advantages or disadvantages relative to other types. In the 1930s, we were still discovering new peoples, new cultures, new tribes. So science, with the best of intentions, treated this issue in the same way that science treats botany or zoology, right? So if you want to learn about plants, the first thing you do is you find all the different plants you can, and then you describe them and compare them. And when you do that, you can start to draw conclusions and make generalizations, and you gain an understanding of your subject. The study of the races of mankind was the same thing, and it was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when it was even possible that all corners of the earth could be accessible to anthropologists without putting their lives on the line in doing so. There was a lot to be learned about the nature of humanity, and so maybe it's fitting that it started with a survey of the variety found within the scope of humanity. Now, today we call these differences ethnographic types, but in Hoffman's day they were called races. Now, the word race, when applied to human variation, is such a loaded term in our day that when we hear a phrase like the Hall of the Races of Man, it sounds like a horrible backwards thing, designed to rank or stratify societies and cultures. And that was not the intention when Hoffman was commissioned to make her voyage. So it's not the science of anthropology itself that's the problem here. But the Hall of the Races of Man can't be entirely left off the hook either. The problem is that anthropology is practiced by humans, who come preloaded with all sorts of presumptions and biases, conscious or unconscious. All of humanity, and frankly much of the animal world, has bias encoded into our genes. Our instinct is to be tribal, to gather in groups who look like ourselves, and regard those who don't look like ourselves as foreign or other. Now, the more we are aware of our bias, the more we can counteract and control it, but we probably can never rid ourselves entirely of it. And in 1930, some biases that, to our contemporary eyes, seem glaringly obvious, were completely under the radar for the otherwise well-intentioned Board of Trustees of the Field Museum and for Malvina Hoffman herself. Take, for example, two of the first life-size statues that Hoffman made for the Hall of Mankind, the statue of the Nordic type and then a statue of an American Indian of the Blackfoot tribe. Now, the Nordic man, in a nutshell, is only a slightly more naturalistic rendering of the Greek ideal. As Hoffman sculpts him, his body is perfectly muscled, not an ounce of fat on him. I mean, far from a typical specimen, he is an ideal specimen. And his arms, the pose that she puts him in, his arms reach out and up in some sort of gesture that suggests striving or grasping for something up high, while standing in a classic contrapposto, completely nude, and his proportions are a nice, heroic 8 heads high. Now compare that to a rendering of the Blackfoot Indian, who is rather stunted in contrast to the Nordic example, and apparently incapable of such perfect musculature as the Nordic type. He wears some sort of loin pouch, and of course he's got a feather in his hair, so we know he's an Indian. And with his hands, this is the most interesting part, he's making a very peculiar gesture, which is only understood when you read the caption under the photo, as it appears in Hoffman's book. The caption reads, "The gesture of the hands means, 'I have seen my enemy and have killed him.'" So on the one hand, we have the classical ideal with its striving gesture and its perfectly formed nudity, and on the other, we have a scrubby little murderous savage with a feather in his hair. However, in 1930, both of these statues were seen as commendable and faithful representations of their types. Like everyone, Malvina Hoffman was a product of her time and place. And she wasn't even an anthropologist. I mean, she was a wealthy New York socialite. Notice that her entourage did not include any anthropologists. Her choice of model, as she encountered different ethnographic types around the world, was entirely up to her. And to guide her selection of what individual represented the group, she had nothing but her own intuitions, and that is to say, her own bias and her presumptions about other cultures. Or at most, she was able to take a cursory look at a small sample of the people that she was studying, from which she might choose a representative. So not only was her selection of the normative type completely arbitrary, she didn't even have the guidance as to what actually constituted a race in anthropologists' definition. And often, her work is denoted by nationality as much as ethnography. Now, there's no doubt that Malvina Hoffman had a genuine respect and interest in people from different cultures, and was absolutely one of the more progressive figures in her day in that respect. However, she had serious limitations as well, and the Hall of the Races of Mankind could never have been the scientific and enlightened learning tool that everyone involved had hoped it would be. Not so long after the opening of the Hall of Man in 1933, questions were raised as to the educational value of this collection. And after the Second World War, with Adolf Hitler rather helpfully throwing a lot of attention on the nature and consequences of racism and dividing mankind into separate groups, the Hall of Mankind became downright controversial. It was formally dismantled soon after Hoffman's death in 1969, and many of the works have been put into storage, although some were placed in odd corners around the museum as decorative works rather than as ethnographic studies. For several decades, the Field Museum just wanted the whole history of the Hall of Man to be forgotten. But in recent years, it seems as though enough time has passed that Malvina Hoffman's works can be viewed in a more historical light and as works of art. More of her work has gone on display in the museum, and nowadays one can even find information at the museum on the misguided cultural oddity that was the Hall of Man. And what of the sculptures themselves? Are they all just racist caricatures? Far from it. It seems that Malvina Hoffman really rose to the challenge of traveling the world and sculpting head after head, figure after figure, and several of her works from this period of sustained and continuous activity can be considered her best work, and there are a few masterpieces. It would seem that the most culturally insensitive of her works center around ethnographic types she would already have been familiar with, and for which Western culture had developed stereotypes. The Blackfoot Indian is a good example of this, as is her Chinese rickshaw driver sculpture. And conversely, her most beautiful work, the work that exudes naturalism and fidelity to its subjects, are usually from areas of the world and cultures which Hoffman might have been much less familiar. And so perhaps Hoffman was not as influenced by personal or cultural bias as much when she produced these works. Many of her statues and portraits from Africa are stunning. Some of her most well-known and best-loved work include the mother and child of the Kalahari Bushmen, her group of the Pygmy family, her statue of a Shilluk warrior, and the work known as Daboa, dancing girl of the Sara tribe. Malvina Hoffman had a long and busy life, full of concerns and interests outside of sculpture. It's a wonder she produced as much sculpture as she did with all her other activities. During both World Wars, she was an active member of the American Red Cross, serving overseas as much as a diplomat as a volunteer, even going on a mission to the Balkans after the First World War to report on conditions there for the Red Cross. After the Second World War, she spent much of the rest of her life traveling and producing work which caught the spirit of place. She would sculpt bullfighters in Spain or Portuguese horsemen. She designed a war memorial for the fallen at Epinal, France, and she sculpted portrait after portrait of friends and members of high society. There is one additional area of pursuit which has earned her contemporary recognition, and that is her literary output. I mentioned Heads and Tails, her accounting of her work for the Hall of Man, and I mentioned her memoir written at the end of her life. But in 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, Hoffman published a sculpture manual entitled Sculpture Inside and Out. The last few podcasts have been charting the production of sculpture manuals by sculptors in the early years of the 20th century, so we're going to add Hoffman's to this pile and talk about it just a little bit. The first thing to notice is that the book is divided into two parts. Part one is more or less, a sort of Hoffman's manifesto on art, written in a conversational tone with lots of asides and anecdotes from her life in art. More on this first part, on part one, in a moment. Part two contains the nuts and bolts of sculptural practice, with all the elements we find in the earlier instruction manuals. There's discussion of study of anatomy and how to build an armature, how to model a portrait and a figure. Hoffman includes chapters on metals and reliefs, sculpting animals, carving stone, casting and plaster and bronze, enlarging and reducing. In comparison to books by Lanteri, Toft, and Jagger, I think Hoffman's is one of the more comprehensive, in that she gives an equal and detailed treatment to every topic she covers, and introduces a new subject of study into the mix as well. She talks about photography. Hoffman offers tips and tricks for working from photos and discusses the advantages and disadvantages of doing so, mentioning the importance of working up your clay in the same lighting conditions the photographs were taken, and giving warning about how photography distorts proportion. Two aspects of modeling from photographs that many contemporary sculptors would do well to study. In general, Hoffman's direction for clay modeling is a fairly even mix of advice. divided between visual technique, advice on working up anatomically and with measurements, and even canons of proportion. She's so even-handed that it's difficult to make assumptions about her own personal working techniques. Although given her experimentation with both naturalism and modernist styles, she certainly had separate techniques for working from life depending on the style she was working in. And discussion on style leads us back to the part 1 of Sculpture Inside and Out. This first section has chapters with titles like The Origin of Form and The Timelessness of Art. In this section, Hoffman attempts to present the craft of sculpture as a timeless phenomenon of human nature, imbuing the pursuit of sculpture with almost mystical properties, which makes the sculptor herself some sort of cultural shaman or high priest. To quote from her introduction, "If one of God's children cannot see or feel life in other terms than those of form, if he tries to escape and live outside of this obsession and fails, he generally calls himself a sculptor. He knows his daily lot will be a searching for form. It may be in stone, in marble, in bronze. It will be a constant analyzing of life itself in terms of three-dimensional silence. But it is certain that if he accepts this yoke of labor, he will plow deep under the surface of life. He will experience miracles and give thanks that he is alive and awake and aware." Now, much of part 1 goes on and on like this, inflating the role of art making and of the artist in society to an almost religious experience or ecstatic trance. Nowadays, this is an all too familiar stereotype of the artist with his inflated sense of almost supernatural self-importance. We're all familiar with this, right? The term artist denoting not just a career field, but a state of being, an impulse that cannot be denied. "I'm an artist, you don't understand. I must create. I must express. I cannot not make art." The very language we use in talking about art production has actually shifted towards mysticism. Artists don't have ideas anymore. They have visions. It's a particular type of art speak that became prominent with the rise of modernism, when modernism had to fight for acceptance, and so artists and critics alike felt the need to recast the role of the artist in society as something different than what it had been in the past. It was popular and accepted for a long time, but people are starting to buy into it less and less these days, especially in light of the crass and soulless art market that dominates the cultural conversation in the fine arts. No one regards Damien Hirst as society's cultural shaman or seer of visions. He's a very lucky, very pragmatic, and very shrewd businessman whose worth is driven by market speculation, and anyone who thinks otherwise is just drinking the Kool-Aid. Anyway, back in the 1930s, the new modernist forms, including Futurism, Surrealism, Cubism, Dada, and all the rest, they spoke of the role and the nature of the artist in fundamentally different terms than how culture viewed the role of the artist in the past. Now, this conception isn't new with modernism, of course. It came about in the 19th century with the Romantics. But modernism advanced this notion and capitalized upon it in a way that earlier art styles simply didn't need to. In her first chapters, Malvina Hoffman didn't say anything that hadn't been voiced previously by many others in the modernist movement, but it is significant that we're hearing it from her, whose fame comes not from her modernist work, but from her naturalistic work. But Hoffman is not just a part-time modernist. She is a huge supporter of it, and her dearest artist friends and mentors are a roll call of modernist sculpture: Rodin, Mestrovich, Bordel, Brancusi. Most of the first section of Sculpture Inside and Out is a defense of modernism, posing questions and doubts commonly raised about modernism, and then refuting these questions one after another. Throughout the book, there's such a strong and genuine sense of optimism and of hope for the immediate future of art coming from Hoffman. It was a time of anything goes in art, and she was hoping for a transformational evolution in art heralded by the modernists. We were on our way there. We hadn't yet arrived, but soon. That's the sense I get, at least, when I read Malvina Hoffman. I think her hyperbole springs from this sense of anticipation of greater things to come. The last book she wrote in her life, her memoir, is titled Yesterday is Tomorrow, and the title itself conveys hope for the future. I scoured this final book, written in 1966, for any clue as to how Hoffman might have felt about modernism and all that came after during her lifetime. I wanted to know if she still felt optimistic about the future of modernist sculpture in the 1960s, or if she thought modernism had lived up to its initial promise. How did she feel about the state of figurative art in 1966? I found almost nothing in this final look back on her life about how she felt about any of it. She's conspicuously silent about post-war trends in art. However she felt about trends in art that happened after World War II, I cannot fault Malvina Hoffman's optimism about it in 1939, because it wasn't an unbounded optimism. As someone whose fame and fortune had rested upon her adherence to the human figure, she knew that she and the world of art was taking a risk by pursuing modernism. And at the same time, she sees this process as part of the cycle of art, as one style replaces another, like the succession of classical revival in the Renaissance, to the Baroque, and then on to neoclassicism, and then on to Romanticism, one after the other. The whole field of artistic creation is in a state of flux, she wrote in her 1939 book. We have revolted against the past and have jumped into the future. But after all, isn't this quite natural? There is no slow or easy way to stop a long habit, except by tearing it out by the roots and facing about in a totally new and opposite direction. The world has a way of turning over in great cycles of evolution and revolution. Lots of little pet ideas and theories are lost in the holocaust of chaos and change, but new ones crop up to take their place, while the fundamental principles of life and art are indestructible and push themselves up above the ashes. Hoffman is right. The holocaust of chaos and change she spoke of certainly happened, but the art that rose to prominence out of the ashes of the 19th century, modernism, postmodernism, conceptualism, is itself in the midst of its own collapse. And it's not going out with a bang, but with a whimper, drowning in a sea of apathy from a culture and a public it has neglected for so long. We all have hopes for the future of sculpture, for what may arise out of the ashes of contemporary art. And though I will make no predictions as to what comes next, I can take some comfort in Malvina Hoffman's assertion that, indeed, yesterday is tomorrow. So that's it for this episode of The Sculptor's Funeral, and for the first season. Hooray! Thank you so much for listening. Several people have asked me what I'm going to talk about next season, as I've covered a good deal of sculpture history already. Well, the fact is, I've only scratched the surface. There are so many fascinating and important sculptors I've never mentioned. For instance, I went from talking about Donatello pretty much right to Michelangelo. I skipped right over Lorenzo Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, the Della Robbia family, Desiderio di Settignano, Verrocchio, and plenty of others. Not to mention that art history didn't exactly start with Donatello. What about Andrea Pisano, Andrea Orcagna, and Jacopo della Quercia? And all these sculptors are just from the early Renaissance. It's going to be years before I run out of material. Well, I hope you are looking forward to the next season as much as I am, and I do want to thank all of you who listen every week, and especially to everyone over at the Facebook group page. Thank you very much for contributing all that you have, and I look forward to more. I'll be posting interesting articles and events throughout the summer on the Facebook group page, so I encourage everyone listening to keep in touch. Have a great summer, everyone.